we're going to be talking today about what a SEND report that Tes has carried out shows us about the school landscape in terms of SEND. I've got two fantastic panellists here. Warren Carratt, Chief Executive of Nexus Multi-Academy Trust, which have 17 schools in South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, and Sarah Johnson, who's an author, consultant, and is also president of PRUSAP, National Organisation for Pupil Referral Units and Alternative Provision. I'm a journalist with Tes, and I know from my own day job I get loads of insight from both of these, so I think this will be a really, really good panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull out three themes that kind of came out from our report. One, you won't be surprised to hear, is funding. Another is the EHCP process. And then finally, a kind of a broader question about how we meet need, how schools can meet need, mainstream and specialist. So if I just give you a couple of stats from the report, 81% of respondents said that they didn't think they had enough funding to meet the needs of pupils with SEND in their school. That's across all settings. And when it came to EHCPs, more than half said that the money that they got was less than half of what they needed when it arrived. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panelists to start with, which is what pressure does that funding situation put on school provision? What do you see being cut or restricted? And what do you think could be done differently to improve SEND provision within the funding that we have? That's quite an open-ended question, but yeah, Warren, if I can ask you to start on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, John. So, hi, everyone. The trust that I'm responsible for has got 16 special schools or hospital school provision. So a lot of my perspective comes from and with that background. I mean, if we look at the totality of the high needs funding issue, because I think I'm surprised it's only 81% of schools that have said they don't have enough funding. I think probably 100% of local authorities would say they need more funding to be able to commission to meet local sufficiency need. And estimates are that by March next year we'll have a £3.65 billion black hole in high needs allocation, which is, by my maths, a third of the annual allocation of high needs funding. So looking at the state of the systemic issues, I think there are real challenges. And how schools have had to bend and flex around that, mainstream and special schools, in the face of a real absence of strategy for the best part of the last 14 years, I think has led us to where we are now. We know that the national funding formula is increasing funding for mainstreams, but I think the majority of school leaders would say whilst there is a record amount of funding in state education, it's stagnated for far too long, so we have an artificial position right now. I think that the challenges around high needs funding coming into mainstream and special schools is a real issue that there isn't a simple answer to, because local authorities do not have enough. And once the accountancy treatment on the high needs deficit ends and it sits on local authority budgets, we're going to see a number of local authorities going bankrupt. And you know, when we look at that macro fiscal position, it's very gloomy and very challenging to think, how can you tweak around the edges to be able to do something different and profound? And yet that's what schools have been doing for the best part of the last 14 years. Mainstream, special, AP. They've been continuing to evolve and expand their offer to meet a rise in need and more complexity. Just go back to your three questions, John, because I'm rambling a bit there, aren't I?
No, that's great. So really, I guess there's three things that I'd be interested to unpick a little bit more. One is what provision has been cut in this context. What other things do you do that you would like to be able to do better with more money? And are there any solutions without more money?
So I think in terms of the provision that's being cut, I think in real terms within schools, and I'm not necessarily saying this is right, but what we've seen is a reduction in the non-teaching workforce, which tends to be the area that is most heavily leaned on in mainstream to support children with additional needs. And we've seen that resource shrink and be rationalised or be taken up with the greater administrative burden that takes away from direct work. And I think that is a real challenge for schools. Again, we look at the recent announcement from Labour about having a specific negotiating committee for non-teaching staff in schools, and I think that feels like a welcome change to me, because it quantifies what the cost is to schools of otherwise unfunded non-teaching costs, and that should hopefully mean that we can quantify it and have a really clear evidence base for what additional funding is needed and where to protect that resource and grow it again. In terms of the sufficiency across the sector, we need a long-term capital investment programme, and I think the backlog, again, I'll hand over to Sarah, but I think the impossible situation that AP's found itself in, being almost a proxy, in my experience, for specialist provision, and special schools being massively over capacity and taking more and more children, means that we need a fit-for-purpose offer now that is just not in place, and we need a realistic assessment of where sufficiency actually needs to lie and how we address the status quo as is to build more space and capacity to just get back onto an even keel. The independent sector has stepped in the meantime, and costs have shot up massively because they sit outside of the state, they don't have guaranteed funding, and therefore unit costs are higher. But that cycle of increased cost and dependency is something which I think has really adversely affected state education, where there's been no strategy for real terms investment in need. Shall I hand over to you, Sarah?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've got a number of different thoughts I wanted to draw upon that Warren has obviously quite clearly stated. But I think we have to be very aware of the increased pressure of local authorities, and their focus now and their activities are often on the statutory obligation, which means what you don't have is the early intervention that can prevent crisis point. That, I think, is one of the key factors around. We can talk about safety valves and all those sorts of things, but actually local authorities are in a really challenging position in how do we meet children's needs from a statutory level, let alone activities that fall underneath that in terms of early years, primary, or before it moves to crisis point. You quite rightly spoke about independent provisions being available more frequently, but I also want to talk about unregulated alternative provision that is coming up as a de facto special needs provision for children with the most complex needs. So we have a kind of growing experience of provisions that might be there one day but might not be there the next day, and it makes it really difficult to plan. But also what you've got with unregulated is actually there is amazing practice happening in lots of unregulated provision, without a doubt. I get to see them, I get to enjoy them and see how children really have their needs supported. But there's also unregulated provision that costs a lot of money, but actually is not supporting the children in the way that we would want. So I think that there needs to be that central planning about what are the needs of the children in our communities and how can we best serve them in the community as well. There's lots of conversations around transport at the moment for local authorities. For some children, their most local school that can support their needs is further afield. Hours of a journey that costs a fortune as well, and quite often transport might cost more than the actual provision they're getting. Actually, what we should be looking at is how do we make sure those children feel like they belong to the local area and we have that commitment. Now, in terms of that funding, it's very difficult to compete with singing, by the way, which is quite glorious over there. It's how do we... So the kind of questions were, what provision has been cut? And I would argue any of the kind of activities that might happen to prevent exclusions have been cut. Any provision that might support children with medical needs in the schooling community have been cut because we can push it out to a local authority who has a statutory obligation. And I think we need to go further about how we address the systemic issues around mainstream schools perhaps not being as inclusive as they should as well. One of the questions, what would you do if you could, is I would absolutely promote the inclusion of children with medical needs in any way possible, or challenging behaviour within the school, and really looking at the systems within the school to include those children. I think too long we are satisfied with the idea that actually we can give a child a teaching assistant that may well support them, but actually it's about the system within that school that needs to be addressed, not the teaching assistant given to them. Now, there's lots of children that might need a one-to-one teaching assistant, my own children included, so I'm not taken away from that. But I think we need to be more innovative and creative about what we're designing for these children and what we want them to have. You asked what the solutions are, is I think we can't have a schooling system where children don't feel like they belong and they're part of something, and we have to fundamentally looking at addressing that. Why are some children on the margins of education? What is it about the curriculum? What is it about the structures of the school, the behavioural policy that means that those more and more children are being pushed on the margins?
Thank you both. There's lots to unpick there, both in terms of the challenge of funding but also how that then creates an extra demand for other bits of the sector, alternative provision and independent. I might just go off piece slightly and just ask one follow-up question, because I think one thing you've both kind of talked about or alluded to is the importance of inclusion. Do you have any thoughts about how that should be achieved? It feels to me like we're at a point in time where a lot of people in the sector are talking a good game about it. It's a real focus. Ofsted have talked about it being an element of their new inspections from next year. The government, I think, have talked about having a need for more pupils with SEND in mainstream. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what the first steps to getting there might be. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, my personal view is we need to redefine what the metrics are around inclusion, because we have a school system now where we're told there are more good or outstanding schools than there ever have been, and behaviour and attitudes, personal development, focus of scrutiny and Ofsted inspection. But it's the data that sits outside and around the school system. And look, I'm a MAT leader, and I think it's impossible to ignore the fact that academies being their own admissions authorities has not helped how pupil placements in mainstream are managed outside of formal processes. So I think what we need is to be able to see a reinvigoration of the data that local authorities hold and captured parental and family experience, and have that reflected in how we assess how schools are being inclusive. Because I've seen a tweet this morning from Johnny Utley, who's, I think, presented today. There are ways in which the system can be gamed to keep your suspension levels low, your exclusion levels low, but to encourage families to take a decision that is, in inverted commas, right for them and their child. And that is unethical, but it happens. And there is data that we can look at. So there's data that's been released today, I think, around and analysed around the number of large trusts, large schools, where they have a higher percentage of children leaving than they were anticipating. We need to start drilling down into what sits at the root cause of that, because the absence of children on a school roll, for whatever the reason, is the metric we need to be interrogating to understand what inclusion really looks like.
So I'm going to take this from different perspectives about how can inclusion be crafted. It is never done, it is never finished, it is continual. And we can have a list of criteria till we're blue in the face, and people will abuse that, because we have to have a sense of actually this is a moral imperative, that we want these children to be part of our community, and they are part of what we want to offer, and they're our future. And I'm going to tell you a story, because stories are great, aren't they? Some of you who may or may not know me, I am a mother of four children, 3 of whom are under 3. So that's why I feel like this is a break for me, so thank you very much. But my 3 younger children all have disabilities. And once a week I take Astrid out, or did take her out to physiotherapy. And I take her out from nursery. She doesn't get physiotherapy on the NHS, by the way, because it's unavailable, and that's another conversation to be had. So I take her to a third sector charity that provides her free physio. And I always wonder about what is her experience of leaving the nursery, which is a mainstream nursery, taking her out to physio and then bringing her back. And Astrid was using her K-walker, and she walked back into her nursery, and a little boy came up to her and said, "Where have you been, my cheeky monkey?" And I nearly cried, and I'll keep every time I tell that story, because I think we need to make sure that these children that are absent from school for whatever reason are missed, and they're cared for, and they're loved by not just the teachers, and not just the support staff, but their friends, and that they're missed and understood. And you spoke about this idea of pupil movement, and I know that's a moment of pupil movement, but pupil movement more broadly around that data, which children are moving into elective home education and aren't doing it for a positive philosophical choice. We have to be clear that actually if we are looking at 3%, 4%, 5% of a school population leaving that school process, there is something very wrong going on there. And we have to be holding schools and trusts to account and saying that this is not reasonable and we do not tolerate it. And, you know, we could talk about different local authorities where they boast about having no exclusions. That is not true. What they have is a series of managed moves where children aren't anybody's cheeky monkeys, because they're moving from one school to another school to another school, into an alternative provision, to a pupil referral unit, back to a school. They never build the links. They never have the support network that they need, and they don't feel like they belong. For me, you cannot talk about inclusion unless you talk about belonging.
Thank you both. That's brilliant. I love that answer. I think it's a really good way of sort of bringing it down to the personal experience, but then extrapolating it back up to what the system needs to be. So I'm going to move on to a second theme in our report, which was education, health and care plans. And again, you might be able to speak with two hats on this, I guess. The survey, unsurprisingly, shows that most people in the system find the process problematic. I think when we looked at responses we got from Senkos, 94% said they struggled with the EHCP process. More than a third saw the EHCPs not come back within the 20-week timescale. And then there was a stat that I mentioned earlier that more than half of people said that they got less than half of the funding that they needed. We've looked at the SEND area reports that Ofsted and CQC produce, which some people have mixed views about. But one thing that comes across in all of those reports where they're critical is problems with EHCPs in terms of timeliness, in terms of being updated, in terms of reflecting the child, and then in terms of those needs actually being met by the system. So yes, I'd like to ask you both, really, what your reflections are about the EHCP process. Does any of that finding surprise you, and what could be done differently to make it better?
I'm really excited to be given the microphone first, because it means I get to moan about my local authority, and I work for local authorities. So my twins have an educational healthcare plan, and I'm going to tell you about the experiences, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what my role is in the wider community. So my experiences were, I requested an educational healthcare plan for my identical twin daughters. And they initially refused Iris, and I went to mediation. And they accepted when I spoke about what her needs were, and she's got an educational healthcare plan. Whilst that was happening, they were deciding whether or not, whether or not they were going to assess Astrid. I sent a message to the head of Children's Services going, look, I don't want you to be embarrassed by this. I want you to make the right decision. You've already agreed in mediation. Astrid has more needs than Iris. So please make sure that you reflect on that. So then a week later, it was refused to assess Astrid. And I said, I just put it all over Twitter because I was sick and tired of having conversations. This is whilst I'm trying to get the support they need as well. They've both got an educational healthcare plan. I then had another daughter, Zelda, and Zelda has never eaten food, and she's 22 months old. She doesn't pull to stand. If you've got time, I've got a video of her walking between two bars yesterday for the first time. She clearly has significant needs. I work in local authorities. You might consider her special appropriate. She doesn't know her name. She said mum for the first time last week with meaning. It's going to make me cry. I have got all the knowledge in the world. I have sat with the DfE and helped, and I've been name-checked in my previous name for the AP and SEND Green Paper. I have all the resources. I've got the money, I've got the knowledge, I've got a Master's in Inclusive Education, I'm doing a PhD, and my God, this is breaking me in every moment. And I think we cannot forget the experiences that your report speaks about, teachers and Senkos and so on. Parents live and breathe it every day. And we wonder why parents get angry. And I tell you why we get angry, because we are sick and tired of waiting for our most basic needs of our children being met. So yes, Zelda was refused a request for an assessment for an EHCP, and I will go through mediation, and I will go through a tribunal, and I will win. And it's kicking it into the long grass. And we continue to kick things in the long grass because we don't want to give early intervention because it is not statutory. And we need to shift that. And we need to shift that urgently, because actually what is happening is children are not getting their most basic needs met. And one of the messages I said quite forcefully to the head of Children's Services and CQC and everyone else, and probably put it on Twitter, is if I was doing this as a parent, you would accuse me and refer me to social care for being neglectful. You tell me what the difference is between what you are doing and the parents that you report. And then we got a little bit of action. So does it surprise me, was your question? No, it doesn't. It disgusts me. And we have to make a change, because I go back to that idea of a moral imperative.
I regret letting you go first now. I wish you would have gone after me. I'm the boring bureaucrat in this, aren't I? So, I mean, there is an inescapable and unavoidable power and truth in everything that you've just outlined there. And I don't have the same lived experience that you have of a child or children with complex needs. But my background is I came from local government into this role. And since 2010, there are 360 fewer educational psychologists across our country. Referral rates have increased for EHCP assessment by 64% since 2020. And I think if we look at putting the challenge in the system, again, my personal view is there is no greater misnomer than the acronym EHCP. The philosophy to move towards a multidisciplinary assessment, I think we all thought were a great idea. The management of that change, the absence of investment, the expectation that local authority facing 50 to 60% budget squeezes in that same period were to try and resource that multi-systemic assessment approach without any real duty on the NHS to have to contribute financially. How anybody thought that was anything other than an initiative destined to fail from the off is beyond me. And I think, again, in terms of where we are right now, it's a sorry state. We've got a system that is so fractured and broken that every parental experience seems to be one of adversarial challenge with local authority to either get a response or get what they feel is their basic entitlement. As you say, statutory, before you even get to all the good work that should give children a, dare I say, sure start in life, which is what were a priority of previous governments pre-2010. I think what we need to have is a much more realistic view of where we are, what the assessment systems are, why the assessment system is the tail wagging the dog, and try to streamline things as much as possible and root it back in trying to be timely, evidential, but have a system that has got a realistic capacity chance of being able to provide the service that's needed. Again, people will have different views. I think the problem that we face with EHCP rates right now is they are seen by schools and families alike, for the majority of cases, I think, as the only means of getting some additional resource or access to it. And that wasn't what they were intended to be. But that is about what's taken out, non-statutory, from the system. So looking holistically, again, there are green shoots. We've got a Labour government that are talking about the importance of early years and an investment there. And that could make a material difference to this. I think the challenge that local authorities face and that the sector and particularly families face between now and when we can start to see the positive effects of that filter through, if there is investment in a revised and refreshed early years offer, is we've got to have the capacity to meet needs between now and then. And that will not be cheap, and that requires a rebalancing of funding. I say it again, £3.65 billion black hole right now. That's not an extra 3.65 billion that local authorities need to make things better. That's an extra 3.65 billion they need to balance a system that your lived experience would say is appalling.
Thank you both. That's brilliant answers. So I guess I'd probably ask something around what we just talked about before, just picking up on what you just said, Warren, but also the other thing we talked about around inclusion. Do you think if the Labour government were to write off council deficits or commit to a much higher level of funding, would that make things better, or would that just pour money into a broken system? And the second bit is, can mainstream schools being more inclusive really reduce the need for EHCPs, and how quickly could that happen? I'm kind of a little bit sceptical about both, but I'd be really interested to hear your take. Do you want to go first again, Sarah? Is that okay?
I'm not as good as this because it's the money side. So I think the first question was, should we wipe off debts of local authorities or put more money in? Would that actually change the system? I think the reality is it wouldn't change the system, because I think it would be arguing that the system potentially works, it just needs more money. I'm not sure that the system is effective and it works, and throwing good money after bad is not really going to make a difference. I think there needs to be a fundamental change in the way that the systems work together. You mentioned it's educational healthcare plans, and where is health? Where is care in this? And I think we like as humans to have really kind of boundaries things around education, health and care, but we know that a lot of children's interventions happen within the schooling environment. That's where we nab all the kids, isn't it? That's why we give them their immunisations at school, because they're more likely to be in that environment. But I think I don't know what the answer is. But what I my sense is just giving more money doesn't matter. I don't think that's going to make a fundamental difference to the system. And I love David Didow's work. I saw him a couple of weeks ago where he was talking about the purpose of the system is what it does. And I wrote a bit for, are we allowed to mention other news places? I wrote for Schools Week around the purpose of the system. What's the purpose of the system for SEND is what it does. Well, at the moment, what it does is it disappoints SENCOs, it disappoints teachers, it frustrates CEOs, it makes local authorities' lives really, really difficult, and it certainly isn't helping children or parents. So I think we need to go back to what do we want the system of SEN to look like and do, and then start designing and crafting the system. And I don't think that's necessarily about money, but that's about reimagining what we want for our children in the future. And I think you had another bit, but I think Warren will probably be better at answering it anyway, because you're really good with the numbers.
Thank you. It's the only thing I'm good at. So I agree and I disagree in some ways. I think that I look at the SEND system like the NHS, and I think there were an accepted wisdom after the pandemic that foundation trusts in the NHS had deficits. Wipe the slate clean and let's start to try and build a better system without the dysfunction of cost saving in there. And whilst it pains me as a taxpayer to say it, I do think that we need to wipe the slate clean for local authorities, because I think what it does is it does reduce the drive of artificial budget saving targets that nobody can ever achieve that are creating dysfunction. Should I sing this next bit? It's very tuneful. Yeah, it's a wonder the glass panes didn't break then when I tried that. So I'd be an advocate of wiping the slate clean, but I think what we need is a realistic forward plan, a little bit like what governments have said about the NHS, where you are very clear over what efficiencies you can generate. And I think that needs to be system-wide across children's services. So you mentioned about, care. We've got a huge billions of pounds sitting in the private sector for residential provision in this country, sitting in the reserves or overseas investment funds because we haven't invested enough in state provision. So I think we need to look at the whole sector around children's services more holistically and look at what an investment and infrastructure strategy is that brings down unit costs but also builds capacity. And that will cost more over the medium term to save, I think, or to reduce the spiralling costs over the long term. But I don't see any other way around that. The likelihood of it, I'm not sure. In terms of making schools more inclusive, again, people will have different views, but I don't think there's a coincidence, or I don't think it's coincidental that we have leapt up the PISA tables in terms of attainment internationally, whilst at the same time ratcheted up demand for specialist provision and families feeling that a school with a focus on high attainment is not necessarily the most conducive environment for their child. And I think that's really sad. And I don't think that price is worth paying. As a society, we certainly can't afford to pay that price fiscally. So, as we said earlier, John, I think one of the first metrics I'd be looking at is how do Ofsted, how does the DFE measure true inclusion in a school, and what does that look like? I think that we need to have a much more rigorous and robust assessment system and process, and more accountability for the agencies therein, such as health, so that it is a burden in terms of cost burden that is not just held by a crumbling local authority financial system, but health have got a real terms part to play. And I think above and beyond all that, we need to have again, personally, when we talk about money being misspent, you mentioned the tribunal earlier, didn't you, in the threat of tribunal. How much of legal services benefited financially from an adversarial process that goes from 0 to 100 without any reasonable arbitration or adjudication in between? And I think that that's a very sensible step that will be relatively low cost if we could give, whether it's local authority, whether it's the new the mayoral combined authorities, whether it's the DFE, give powers that sit well below that threshold without all the anxiety and angst that generates. Give somebody power to stipulate and to arbitrate on where we have a disagreement and the absence of consensus between a school and a parent. So the ante isn't upped, and there's the capacity for schools to be told at an earlier phase what is expected of them. I'll stop in a second, John, but the one thing that I find perplexing is my background is not... I worked as a TA in education 20 years ago. I'm a professional bureaucrat. I'm a human resources professional. And my constant bone of contention with state education is where do reasonable adjustments fit in our vernacular? Because in the employment world, employers, I think rightly and understandably, are very wary of not making reasonable adjustments for the risk of litigation. We don't seem to have that same mindset, that ethical and that consequence mindset of reasonable adjustments in education. But I think any government moving from high attainment to a more inclusive, less results-driven system will have to walk the tightrope of being soft on expectation. And I think that is a real challenge for for Labour coming into power now and anybody who formed a government, because we've opened the Pandora's box on. We're up there in the PISA rankings. We're doing a great job in pushing standards. But again, at the same time as having a huge overspend on high needs, and a minority, but still a significant minority, of children and families feeling alienated from that system at great financial cost to the state and great cost to individual families and children.
Fantastic, thanks both. That's brilliant answers. In a way, you took opposing views on whether wiping off councils' debts was the answer, and I kind of agreed with you both, even though you were disagreeing. I'm a SEND parent as well, and we've had some adverse experiences around transport, and I asked myself, to what extent is this about their capacity, or to what extent has the capacity meant that the mindset of decision making is as it is? And I think it is difficult to know. And there's loads to unpick there, but I'm going to move on to another of our findings, which kind of links to the first thing we talked about, which is basically we asked people about how easy it was, easy is probably the right word, how practical it is being able to meet the needs of children with SEND in their school. And more than 4 in 5 said that they found it very challenging. That's across all settings. And one bit that really jumped out at me was, it's not a massive percentage, but 1 in 5 said that they felt less confident in meeting the needs of pupils with SEND than they did 3 years ago. So we're not talking about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, immediately pandemic. It's a situation where a fifth of people said that they were less confident now than they were 3 years ago. And I just wondered why that is, what's driving that. Is the kind of the body of need across the cohort of children more complex and more demanding, or is it the mainstream schools have too many constraining pressures which mean they can't meet need? And let's go to you first on this one, Warren, if that's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I don't know if people have seen David Bartram's work, a former advisor to the department on special educational needs and disabilities, and he once presented in a meeting I was in, and I may be misrepresenting his findings, but what struck me is he said, if you are a boy who is born in the late spring and summer months, you are twice as likely to be defined by a school as having a special educational need or disability. Now that is statistically correct, but that can't be right. And the risk here is that, the risk of what I'm about to say is that it feels like it's undermining the assessment of SEND, and that's not my intent, but I think we need to look at the medical model of diagnosis in this country, because we start out by having to define what is not right or what is atypical with a child in order to be able to then set the wheels in motion of trying to get more resource. So we start with a negative lens, and it's linked inexplicably and inextricably to resource allocation. But I think that there is a question for our primary sector in the round about what are we describing as SEND, and what is just a child that's a little bit younger than other children in their class who just needs, I'll come back to the phrase again, a reasonable adjustment, a little bit of top-up to help them catch up to their peers. And I think, again, that's part of the dysfunction in the system that we've got now. Now, clearly, the example you were given earlier, it is not the case for every child, but I reject the notion that if you are a boy and born in the spring, you should be twice as likely to be diagnosed by a school as having SEND. That makes no sense to me. So I think if there's a way that we can rationalise what is driving that, let's really understand what's driving that decision-making. And if it is resource, let's try and look at different means of allocating resource that don't require that application process, that huge administrative burden for schools and for families and waiting time of having an assessment undertaken. If there's a way to be able to lever more resource. And I think that that's where local authorities should be able to play a reinvigorated role. What that looks like, how that looks, I don't know. But these are issues which have crept in since really the birth of austerity in 2010, and it feels impossible to ignore since the huge butchering of the Sure Start initiatives, which were intended to be able to identify these needs early. It's what you said at the start, Sarah, isn't it? And to start to respond before needs escalate. Have I answered your question there?
I think that's great. There's loads to unpick there, but yeah, Sarah, can I?
So, I'm just sort of reading through what you've written, and I think there's bits around what you said. Sorry, I think that schools have lots of opportunity to meet children's needs, but they probably need a better understanding about how those needs might present in the classroom and what interventions and strategies might support. So I was at the Radio 4 Women's Hour show a couple of weeks ago, just as an audience member. They wouldn't let me be on a panel, sadly, but thank you for letting me be on a panel. And they were talking about lots of speech and language therapists being trained. That's great. We need speech and language therapists, but that's going to be 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 years. And you mentioned, I think it was 364 less ed psychs. That is a huge number. That is a huge caseload of activity and support for our schools. And local authorities, some local authorities have great models where specialist advisory teachers who understand profound and multiple learning difficulties, speech and communication needs, social, emotional, mental health will go in and support the schools. That's often not part of statutory activity, but to kind of stop the escalation. But I think there's a crisis around recruitment and retention in public services. So it's not just about teachers and teaching assistants, but it's the wider workforce that feeds into that. And I think we need to look at, okay, we need to train more, but what about the interim in order to skill our workforce to be able to develop those inclusive practices? Because actually sometimes it's having ideas and being innovative and creative and being told, actually, this is an evidential basis that will help your child, for example, with speech production, or this is what Makaton looks like, and we're going to train you in level 1, 2, we're going to teach you how to use PECs. But there's little and few of that available for schools to be able to draw upon that resource. And I think that's because we don't have enough staff in the public sector working. And that's because, let's face it, you can get a probably less adversarial role in a different job and get more money.
Yeah, they're all really, really good points. I'm going to now ask if anyone in the audience wants to ask any questions, and then we can share the mic around and get Warren and Sarah's answers to your thoughts if anyone does. If not, I've got loads more. But right, so the lady at the front and then gentleman at the front.
Your last point about providing quality first teaching in schools, because that's what inclusion is. I'm employed by Kingston University to make sure all our initial teacher trainers are trained to make all lessons inclusive, and it's in the area of literacy, so it's for dyslexics and people that struggle with literacy. And as part of that, we realised we can't send these newly trained teachers, early career teachers, out into schools because the classroom teachers and the senior leadership team haven't had the training. So we've put together CPD for schools, and it's really hard to get the schools to sign up. It is free. And I just get the impression that everyone's so stretched. I don't know how to get the word out there. We want to provide free training, but we just don't know how to get out. So I would like your advice for how to do this.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges of the MAT system has created a number of challenges. I'm a MAT leader, but I am not necessarily a dyed-in-the-wool advocate of everything that the system's created. And I think one of the fragmentation elements is we'll look after our own schools, we'll provide that offer. That's not every MAT, that'd be really unfair to say, but there are a number of multi-academy trusts that do that. I think channels into local authority maintained schools have become more and more scarce because local authority school support functions have withered on the 14-year vine of negligence and underfunding. But that's where I'd pitch things. I'd aim it. There's a number of MATs now. I think the research that Tes have done and others will say that there's multi-academy trusts tend to have at least one, if not more, senior leaders with responsibility for the leading of SEND and the coordination of SENCO work within trusts. And it tends to be at trust level that if it's not controlled, in my experience, it is facilitated. The Department for Education require all trusts to put contact details in, get information about schools, so it is an FOI away from being able to pull all that information out and create a distribution list. But that's where I'd be pitching it, where in your position. I'd be aiming it firstly at multi-academy trusts and maintaining authorities with a request for them to cascade, and then at least there's a chance that it's connected into those communication channels. I think locally, another area where we tend to get a lot of advocacy from a school's perspective is parent-carer forums. So they have a statutory footing still, I believe. They have a huge presence in local areas, and often they have a large degree of positive and constructive influence with local schools. So I think those details should be available by the department as well, because they initially... Yeah, or the local offer, yeah. So one way or another, there will be contact details available, and I think parent-carer forums could be a huge advocate for that valuable free resource that you've just said that you offer.
Great stuff. I'll ask this gentleman for his question now. If anyone else wants to ask, we've probably got time for one or two more.
Hello there. I work with permanently excluded students. I'm SENCO for an AP provision. And one thing I see increasingly happening over the 6 years I've been SENCO is the amount of money that local authorities are giving to private companies for provisions that, I'll give you one example. There is a local provision, it's a very good provision, that the local authority use as part of a package. They will use this private company to provide they use angling to re-engage and mentor young men, many of whom have got both special needs and maybe antisocial criminal behaviours. Now that provision is extremely expensive and could be provided in the public sector at a fraction of the cost. And you talked a lot about the deficits of the local authorities, and I do wonder how much of that deficit is basically profits going to shareholders and private companies, and what can be done about that, and how, or is that a road we've gone down where there's no return? It seems the same thing has happened in the health service. We've gone the same way in SEN, and how do we come back from that? How do we grow those provisions within the public sector, and actually, instead of spending more money or the same money, but spending that money better?
I'm going to answer that from my kind of president of PRUSAP hat, so Pupil Referral Units and Alternative Provision, and representing them. I started working in the sector, I think it's probably 21 or 22 years ago, something like that. And there was... The phrase alternative provision didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. It was pupil referral units, and then we had a little fiddle of playing with the edges of calling them short stay schools. Timpson report came out, another conversation, should they be called PRUs, schools, or something else? Doesn't matter what they're called. What it matters is that we're planning on a local authority level to understand what the nature of the needs are of the children that we're working with. There are always going to be children that struggle within mainstream education. Now, that might be because of internal reasons for the child or because of the way mainstream schools are set up. They're probably more likely it's a mixture of all of the above and social situations as well. I think if the local authority has forward planning in terms of commissioning, and we shouldn't be, lots of pupil referral units are operating, and alternative provisions as well, are operating on yearly service level agreements. You cannot function like that. It is not appropriate. We should be looking at 5-year service level agreements, 10 years, and looking at population and growth and understanding what the need and the through route is from what we would have called Sure Start, but those early years provisions right through, so that we aren't relying, and I use this phrase, pop-up PRUs, where, and they're not PRUs because PRUs are local authority led, but it's not so nice because it's not, you haven't got the same sound, but pop-up PRUs where all of a sudden a provision arrives, costs a fortune, and it's not there. 2-3 months down the line. You know, it happened in Birmingham, and I presume it's still happening, because you've got these children out of schools, and local authorities know they have a statutory obligation, so they get forced into this position of being reactive rather than proactive planning, but also addressing what that child's needs are right before they need that statutory obligation. And that provision may be doing wonderful work, and I'm sure it is, but actually, should we be looking at what the provision is on offer in the local authorities to support that child's needs in-house? Probably. Or even if it's a well-established supportive academy in the community, are they able to do the outreach and support? The Send an AP Green Paper talks about those Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. I want to see it enacted. I want to see it happening throughout, and it shouldn't be. So the CSJ, Centre for Social Justice, did some research about the cold spots of AP. There's some areas with no registered AP, and that's because it was felt that it wasn't needed, but then there wasn't provision put in place. So what happens is they need to provide that education so people can charge what they want. So...
Just very quick, just really, really quickly, is my experience is, having worked in local authority, they don't commission at all. And I think the absence of commissioning is a real challenge for our public services. They procure, in what you've just described there, on a case-by-case basis. So if I were looking at what a solution were to look like, sticking to my point earlier that you need to wipe the slate clean, I think the emergence of the combined authorities, the functions of mayors, provides a unique opportunity to both reposition where strategic commissioning should take place, redefine what commissioning actually needs to look like, because it is an investment in need that you can't always quantify at the beginning, but is there over time. And I think allow that new public service, that new orthodoxy of public authority, to manage its finances in a way where you don't have to have a fully spent budget at the end of the year to risk losing it or not being able to carry it forward. So, you know, that is huge and complex, but I think there is an opportunity to both wipe the slate clean and reposition the commissioning of these needs on a regional level, take it away from the weeds of local authority, because you've got huge county councils, or where I'm from, Rotherham, very, very small urban area, elevate it up, but give them really clear definitions of what you expect and regulate as a government how they do that, and that will hopefully move us to a world where we do commission rather than spot purchase at eye-watering cost.
Great, thank you both. That's a really good question and really great answers. I think, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. So, as I say, this report that we've talked about, I've only just given you a snapshot for, but if you want to scan there, you'll be able to read the full thing on Tuesday. And can I just ask you to give our panellists a warm round of applause? I thought they were both absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah, go on then, one more. We'll do another 45 now.
Thank you so much for fitting me in. Very quick, but I think it's quite important to end with. Warren, can I call you Warren?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, and apologies if I didn't write this down correctly, you said we need to look at the medical model. We need to first find out what's wrong with the child. And apologies if that wasn't exactly right. We are raising up our children under a deficit lens. Now, when I joined, I wasn't here at the very beginning, but when I joined, you were talking about inclusion and belonging. And my question is, how do we expect for our children to feel they belong if we are looking at them under a lens of deficit? If our external view of them is they are less than?
I'm going to draw upon Tom Shakespeare's work, who talks about, and I'm sorry, Tom, if he listens to this and says that's not quite what I said, but as I understand it, he talks about the idea. So Tom Shakespeare is a professional disability writer, sociologist, also I'm pleased to call him my friend, and he has a chondroplasia and is in a wheelchair. We cannot deny what his medical needs are, but what we can look at is how society responds and supports to those needs. I spoke to a lovely guy earlier, Omar Abdi, who uses eye gaze technology. And what I noted, which was interesting, is someone went to go and speak to the person who was pushing his chair, but not to Omar. And we need, I think, I absolutely know that my children have disabilities, and I want a framework and a lens to understand what support they need. Now, actually, it's almost by the by why my 22-month-old has never eaten and doesn't stand and all those sorts of things. But it gives me a framework to understand what their needs are. I've got Tourette's syndrome as well. My Tourette's, it gave me, and the diagnosis gave me a framework and understanding of what support I might need. But that doesn't mean that those people with those diagnoses don't belong in our communities. We have to make sure that we have that moral imperative. Again, I keep on drawing upon that we include all children and all people in our society. As I just wanted to talk to that because I think you can hold both.
That's great. That's a really, really great answer. Thank you for that question. That was really good. And yeah, I'll just wrap it up now and then. So if you could give our panelists another round of applause, if that's okay, and appreciate you coming along. Thank you.